Well, good evening, everyone. We're really close to 8 o'clock, so I'll let people in as they join. We're really happy tonight to have Michelle Woodcock with us to talk about some behavioral supports in the IEP process. And I know that that's been an ongoing issue for many families that are looking for some support. So Michelle comes to us from the Department of Public Instruction, and we're so glad that she's going to do one tonight, and she's also going to do one again in March around behavioral support. So thank you, Michelle, for helping us to do some topical calls and getting some information out there for families. So I'm going to make you the co-host, and
Okay.
I will let you take it away.
All right. Well, I will share my screen. Okay. There we go. All right. I am Michelle Woodcock. I'm a special ed coordinator at the Department of Public Instruction, and I taught for 10 years, mostly with children with social, emotional, and behavioral needs. So that's where a lot of this background comes from, as well as just that I get to at the state hold, we call them portfolios, or areas we get to kind of research and dig into and get to know. So I have the federal definition of emotional disturbance. I have that category for students with disabilities, as well as behavioral health, school discipline, all those topics. So I will go through this tonight, and you're seeing a presentation where I've done a similar version for teachers. And I really struggled with tonight how much that I really didn't edit too much. So I'm going to present it somewhat like that, but I want you guys to stop me if there's any point where you're like, hey, go over this again or clarify this. Because like Janine said, I will be back. So we have some time. If we don't get through everything, we can certainly kind of pick some stuff up. But I also know that many of you, if you have children who have some kind of behavioral need, may be as much or more of an expert than I am at this. So we'll get started, and I appreciate, like I said, we did get snow here in Bismarck. They were snow plows right outside my doors. If we heard beeping, that could happen. Or I have a 6-year-old. So again, who knows who may just walk through. Right? That's the fun of, to me, that's the fun of the online meetings. You just never know what might happen.
For sure.
So when we talk in special ed, really on any kind of category, one of the things we really think about is, what does the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, say? And as far as kids and behavior in school, it kind of gives us a contradictory thing. It says two things. It says schools have this duty to provide an education to every student, regardless of behavior. But then it also says schools have a duty to maintain safe and orderly campus. And sometimes those can be contradictory things. But what we would tell a school is how we're going to solve this problem is through some of those tools we have in our toolbox. So that's what we're going to talk about today. But they also, in IDEA, let you know that there is a relationship between behavior and learning, and we have to not only consider it, but act on it if it's impacting learning. And so I'm not going to play this tonight because I feel like otherwise we're not going to have time for all of our topics. But when the notes get sent out, there's a link to this video, and I share it with teachers because it's kids talking to their teachers. And it's just that reminder of, you know what, sometimes I need to fidget in my chair. Or sometimes if you tell me to sit up straight, all I can think about is sitting up straight. And so it gives a really good perspective to teachers. I think it's a great one to parents. I think you probably already know this. But again, I just want to make sure we have time to talk about these other things, or if we get done early, we can come back. But it will be, a link for it will be in the video, in your notes. And I am giving Denise a copy, like she said, of all of these, and I have links to many sites that will be linked. Like you'll have the links to click on to see things easier and everything. So one of the things we always talk about is not only the form of behavior. The form means what we see. The function is why they do that. But so first we're going to talk about the forms. Like, what do we see with behaviors? I think many of you would say, yep, seen some of these. Like externalizing behaviors are those things that you can easily see: hitting, biting, tantrums, self-injurious behavior, throwing things, inappropriate language. But sometimes those internalizing behaviors are ones that are even harder to pick up, or sometimes even harder, especially in a classroom where there's so many children to pick up, when they're isolating, avoiding, withdrawal, or having maybe preoccupation or set focus on a certain topic and don't want to move past. And before we kind of start talking about all behavior, this to me was a really powerful visual, is that in order to get to self-regulation, which would be over here, we need to have these skills of executive functioning, they're called. So executive functioning are all those kind of things that require like planning, organizing, paying attention, completing tasks. So before we can regulate our emotions, we have to have some working memory, which means we have to be able to hear something and be able to hold it in our head for a while and spit it back out. I know even I have a 6-year-old, like I said, he struggles with working memory. That's something I know already. That may mean I need to give single prompt directions. That may mean I need to give him more time to process through what's there. Cognitive flexibility. Can they switch what they're thinking about or transition if they're in the middle of doing something and you give them another direction? Can they be flexible enough to switch? Do they have some impulse control? So even if they want to do something, can they hold themselves back for a few minutes? If they can't do those things, it makes self-regulation hard. But then on top of all of this, so we need these skills of executive function to regulate. But if a student gets stressed out and goes into that fight or flight mode, we move out of the part of the brain that can do those executive functioning skills. We move to our just primitive fight flight part of our brain. And in fight or flight, we're probably not going to be able to do any of those because that's just not the part of the brain that's working. So we really need a student in that kind of calm state that's not fight or flight with these executive functioning skills into place. And executive functioning skills develop up until a child's 25. So there is a lot at play to get to self-regulation. So when we see kids struggling with it, it's a big task. And it does take some work and some instruction and learning. And sometimes that patience, that can be really hard. I feel like even harder as a parent. I did a lot of my years of teaching without a child of my own. And now I'm like, ooh, this would have been much harder if it was my child. And for those who know me, I have a real passion for language and the impact that language has across disciplines. So I always share this when I can, especially with teachers, because I think sometimes we don't think about how language is kind of this core and it impacts social skills. And social skills are like things like interactions, communication, the pragmatics of language, but behavior. It's how we talk to ourselves. It's how we regulate, sometimes using that self-talk to regulate our feelings. And then, of course, our regular academics, our reading, writing, our listening, our speaking, all comes with the core of language. And the other part we don't often think about is that language is also the core of several disability categories when we look at our federal disability definitions. Autism has a heart of it that's language-based. Of course, there's specific speech language disorders. A specific learning disability has a core of language. Emotional disturbance has some language to its core. So it's like, I often preach to schools when I can about, can we do more language young? Because I feel like it might also help make some of those interventions. But as we talk about students with social, emotional, behavioral needs, there was several different studies done, and some done in 2014 had found that 81% of students that were identified with an emotional behavioral disorder had below average language skills. 47% had a moderate to severe language impairment. But one of the issues is that most of those kids go unidentified. If they have an emotional or behavioral disorder, they don't go identified with language, sometimes because the behavior impedes the ability to assess and the language. But it's hard because I think it can't be identified just from behavioral disability, like difficulties alone. You have to have students who are able to participate in some of the language screenings. And sometimes I feel like our kids who have some behavioral struggles can be some highly verbal kids, right? I think I had a kiddo who I taught more in kind of a self-contained environment. So I had this kiddo from when he was kindergarten up through 5th grade. But we went most of his years of schooling thinking we knew he had some social language issues, but we didn't know to what extent, I guess, or we didn't look, because this kiddo could sit and speak for hours on, I mean, he's taught me everything I know about the moon, so much, like so many different topics. He was just this little expert on. And he's so communicative. And even when he was up after if he got escalated that day, when he came down, he could help us problem solve where things went wrong. He could talk to us and give us so many details that we really didn't do as much digging as we could. And one day we were encouraged. I was lucky to be in a big urban city in another state. And we had some university behavioral support staff who came in and consulted. And we did a language screener that really went to basic language. And as we tracked all the way down, one of the first things that a child should develop with language is that they should have what's called joint attention, meaning that if I say, hey, do you see what's over there? The child's going to turn and look over there with me. Or if everybody in the classroom turns their heads looking at something, the kid gets the cue from just seeing others to know to turn and look at what they're looking at. And as we talked on this team, his parents were like, wow, he doesn't do that at home. And as we started talking about it, we realized he was missing some of those things that were like beginning communication. You know, if you think about how often, if you don't turn and look at the things other people are looking at, are you getting the whole message? And so even thinking some of those things through is something that I'm trying to dig in more and encourage as well. I think some of our SLPs in schools are amazing at doing this, and just looking at ensuring that we've comprehensively evaluated and looked at all the pieces of a child. So when we're writing an IEP, and this is probably a little small, but one of the things I wanted to show you is this is after you write the whole beginning part of a IEP that talks about what your child is currently doing, you get to this other page of the IEP, and it basically asks you questions about, does your child have limited English proficiency? Are they blind? Are they deaf or hard of hearing? Are there communication needs? But the question number 6 at the bottom says, does your child have a behavior that impedes their learning or the learning of others? And so the team has to decide, are we seeing behaviors at school that impede their learning or that of others? And then if you mark yes, it tasks the IEP team with putting in place one or more of the following. So you can do one of these things, you can do 2, you can do 3. But there should be either accommodations or modifications put into the IEP for supports that the child needs. You may write an IEP goal to address one of the needs. Like if you're seeing that child struggle with some of those executive functioning, right? They need to increase that working memory. We might put in a goal to try to work on that. Or we're going to complete a functional behavioral analysis, and we're going to write a behavior intervention plan. And those sound very complicated, but today we hope we can break them down a little bit more for you guys to understand what those look like or what typically would go into those. And of course, we have a guidance document that walks through that functional behavioral assessment and behavior intervention plan. It is on our DPI website. And again, the link will be in the notes. You can just click on the link and it will take you right there. So what is a functional behavioral analysis? Well, by definition, it's a comprehensive and individualized problem-solving process that addresses challenging behaviors. So it looks beyond that form of what does the behavior look like and sound like, and it's going to focus on what causes it or maintains the behavior. It's called the function. And then who is this for? Well, it's for any student, again, where we're having that behavior disrupting their learning or that of others. A functional behavioral analysis, or FBA, can be done for students who are on an IEP, but it also can be done for students who are on a Section 504 plan. So if your student has not qualified for an IEP, but is on a 504, this process, if they're seeing it impede learning, behavior impeding learning, this still is a step they can take. And ideally, we're conducting this process before we get to such an escalated spot where the behavior is now causing disciplinary issues such as suspension or expulsion. However, sometimes things escalate quickly and that may have already happened. And then who can conduct an FBA? Well, there's many people. A special education teacher, a school psychologist, a behavior analyst, guidance counselors, gen ed teachers, intervention specialists, school administrators. There really isn't guidelines in the federal Individuals with Disabilities Education Act telling who can or can't do this. They do say it should be a trained personnel. And you can, like a behavior analyst goes to school and comes out of training with this exact skill set. School psychs get training in some of this. But I know as a special education teacher, in spending time and working with some of those people, I had done enough of them to know some of the components to be able to help and assist and put that together on my own. So I would just ask, or I think you're always free to ask if they're, what training they've had or who is training and who is completing the process. So a question we often get is parental consent required? And I've sat at a few different law conferences and I just assume the answer would always be, of course. And it becomes a very gray area. Yes, best practice would be you should absolutely sign consent, because odds are this counts kind of toward like an evaluation where if they're collecting new information on your child, you should be aware and know exactly what's going to happen. However, you can do part of a functional behavioral analysis, as we talk about here in a minute, by only reviewing data that's already been collected. And if you don't collect anything new, in theory, if there was a parent, sometimes we hit somewhere, if you call, maybe they're not calling back or something's not being done and the student is at risk to themselves, then sometimes the best practice is to use the information you have and take a step. But especially if a student is not yet been identified with a disability, so not even on a Section 504 plan, and you're seeing some significant behavior, it would definitely be a process you'd want to do, have signatures if you can, and to start that evaluation process. Because we also talk about in special education a child find requirement. Like every district has a child find requirement, meaning if there's students with disabilities, we are supposed to find who they are if we can and offer support or tell them we stand ready to help support them, whether parents choose to have the school support or not. And so if we see behavior impeding learning over and over and over for any student, that is actually a flag as a child find issue, because there may be something at play, kind of the same as how like when a child is struggling with attendance, that can be a child find issue as well. Like, is there anxiety or what is triggering that they might not come to school? So again, like I said, without consent, you can look through some existing data, but it's only those kind of things that are already there. Attendance, records, grades they've received, how they are in the building, their citizenship, and just referrals to the office or those kind of things. Teachers and administrators can share any information they have, and functional assessment observations or interviews that were previously conducted. They would not do new interviews or things. They would look at what has been done before. And you would think about any instrument you routinely use with all students. So then we get into how do we conduct the FBA? And please stop me, you guys, at any point if there's questions where you're like, hey, I need to ask about this. So why do we do an FBA? Because it answers some of these questions, like what behavior do we want to change? What level does the behavior exist at? So how often is it happening, or how long does it last? Have we seen circumstances that are likely to trigger a behavior? Because man, if we can figure out some of those things that come before it, we can maybe prevent it, right? Is the problem behavior influenced by certain events or conditions? What function does the problem behavior serve? What replacement behavior should we teach? I think that was one of my early in my career, because I don't think we always give those special ed teachers as much behavioral support in school as we wish we had. I know I did not, but I had some amazing team members around me, was that we can keep talking about the behavior we want to go away, but what do we want to happen in its place? And until we have that plan for what should happen in its place, we're not going to probably see that behavior go away. And is the problem behavior a performance deficit or a skill deficit? This one was also a what? wow to me, because is it that the student cannot perform the behavior? Is that there's something they're avoiding or that they just can't do? Is it that they can't carry it out or they haven't been taught a skill, right? So we either can't do something or have we been taught? So to do a functional behavioral analysis, there's essentially 4 steps. We're going to identify the problem behavior. We're going to get some information. We're going to summarize that data and then formulate kind of why we think it's happening. And it's really a hypothesis. It's kind of a whole big science process. And, you know, sometimes you get it really right away, but sometimes we go through this process and we try and we learn we have to tweak things as we go. I think anybody who has a child with some of those emotional behavioral needs, you know, there's not really a quick Band-Aid fix. It's more, we keep making it better in increments as we go, and we'll slowly, hopefully get there. So here was an activity that I think can help paint a picture as we think about, as we talk about behavior. So I'd like you just for a second to think about your favorite chocolate cake. Just think about what does it look like? What is, you know, there's a picture of one here, but what does yours look like? What is it? What's the frosting like? What is the texture like? And if you don't mind, just throw in the chat, like, what is your favorite chocolate cake? Or yell it out loud. I'm okay either way. Ooh, German chocolate. I seem to get that about every time. Just think about it though. Do you think that if like, ooh, oh, the one on the screen, yeah. Oh, fudgy with chocolate ganache. That's closer to me. I really love like the chocolate lava cake. Dark chocolate. Okay. Oh, so dark chocolate versus milk chocolate. So even just in this handful of us on here, if I said, hey, let me know anytime you see a chocolate cake, or let me know when your favorite chocolate cake is on the screen, we would have different answers. And sometimes what happens and why we do this FBA is because I might say to you, hey, I want you to go into this classroom and I want you to put a tally mark on this paper every time the child is off task. But the question is, are we going to all define off task the same way? It's kind of like that chocolate cake. We each may have our own version of chocolate cake, even though it sounds pretty specific. So if I'm saying that we might be seeing different things, we need to better define what we are trying to look for. What does that behavior look like? So that we are all on the same page and we all know exactly that's when the behavior is happening or that's when it's not. So we have to pinpoint the behavior that's causing the problem. And we have to objectively know and be able to observe the behavior in different settings. Ideally, we're including home and we're including like community settings. Oftentimes during this process, that's where a parent would help us and maybe give their input or take some data for us. The teacher's expectations for the student. You know, where can the problem behaviors stem from? Frustration, fear of embarrassment, boredom with the teachers, and whether a behavior can be related to cultural differences or expectations. I had a student who had started at my school and yes, was from a culture where like they didn't have to listen to women and the expectation was directives came from men. And so at first in the school, he struggled with listening and following directions from women, which in an elementary school, which is where I was, that's most of the staff. And slowly over time, as he got used to the cultural expectations, that did go away. But it was important for us to know. He was also a student who often would write from right to left instead of left to right. And it was something we were trying to correct, where in his native language, how his parents wrote, the culture writes right to left. Very important for us not to completely squash that then, but to help build the differences between. So again, How would we define a behavior? Well, we can think about it. So eloping is a fancy word for a child who might just run, right? So something gets hard, fight or flight, the child flights. That is not, I think sometimes we just instantly think that's a bad thing, but it's their body telling them they've got to go. And you can't fight that, nor do we want them to lose that in case of danger. But a team could, kind of like that chocolate cake, I could just call it chocolate cake, which would be option A. I would be saying that, hey, eloping is not being where this child's supposed to be and not paying attention. Or I can define it more like option B, which is saying eloping is any attempt or success at the following. So we are saying, when the child's sitting, if he turns his body away from instruction or the task, including putting his head down, that to him is eloping. So that's him avoiding the task. If he slides out of his chair onto the floor, if he stands up and leaves the location or the staff person, during transitions in the hall, if he walks away from the line or the adult, if he leaves the designated classroom, or if he pushes his chair away from the desk or the table. Now, if I had to go into a classroom and take data on how many times the child was eloping, I would want to have option B kind of definition to know when I would put that tally mark. If I had to do option 1, that's leaving it on me, a lot of it, to assume if the child's doing what they're supposed to be doing. And a part of that is we also need to know what's true for that child, because I think many of us, some people can draw or color on their paper while they listen to something like even tonight, like as you're sitting on the webinar, many of you may be at home drawing or coloring or doodling, and you can still focus. To some people, if you are drawing or doodling, you may completely lose track of what you're listening to and more be focused on to what you're doing. So it depends on person to person if that helps you focus or takes away focus. So during these definitions, it's also important to outline that. So for option B, this student, when he puts his head down, means he's tuning out what you're saying. But I have had the exact opposite student where the only times he was truly listening to me was when his head was down, because that's how he could tune out all his other sensory issues and be focused right on me. So it's important for us to know that what's true for one student may not be for another. And so it's important for the IEP team or for parents, if you're taking data at home, to be like, hey, this is where I would count this, or this is where I wouldn't. Because I don't know about you, but I know even with my husband, sometimes him and I perceive our child's behavior different, right? We each have our own perspective, or like, that's not him avoiding us. So again, having that defined behavior helps. It's actually called I call it the fancy Nancy word, is that it's operationally defining the behavior. You're making it operational, where anybody could take action by knowing if it is or is not the behavior. So after we outline it very specifically, we're going to gather sources of information. And again, we can review all those past data points we already have, because odds are for this student, for any student as a school, you have different data points. So again, we know, what does this child's disability look like at school or in the classroom? Or what does their behavior look like? What if there is no disability identification? Do we know anything about a health history? Parents, you guys are a great source of some of this. Is there medications or side effects that could be at play? Any info you guys have to offer? Is there trauma history? We do have a lot of kiddos in the state too in foster care, or some of those, so that information can really help for some of our kiddos. Are there patterned or cyclical behaviors that families have seen? Have there been some office discipline and referrals? Look at academics. Has there been a change in grades? Has there been something with homework completion? All these different things can play in, and any other pertinent information that can be shared, whether through the IEP team members, and especially I feel like sometimes you parents have just the best information, because you have more experience in many settings. And then what has been tried already? I think always as we start this, we want to say, what have we tried? What were the results? How long did we do that? How long was it implemented? Who did it? And what was the fidelity? And that's that fancy word for meaning, did we do it consistently? Or did everybody who is working with the student do it the same? So we're kind of checking on, was it done the same? Was it done appropriately? What did that look like? And we always want to look at our students' strengths, right? Like, what are their interests? What do they do well? What environments are they successful in? Because I have yet to meet a kid who doesn't have some environment that they are successful in. What peers do they work well with? And what teachers do they work well with? Because one of those things with behavioral response is relationships. And we need to sometimes stop and not even focus on academics till we've built some relationships, especially. And I think one of the biggest moments for me was that I taught in a suburb of St. Louis. I had a kiddo whose family had gone through a due process hearing. They were not happy with the school he was at, with the response they were getting. And he was being moved to a more intensive environment, which was where I was. And so he was being moved to my classroom. And so I went to meet with his team. And just as we talked about, I tried to ask some of these questions. What are the strengths? What has gone well? How is he doing on his progress, on his IEP goals? The team presented 0% progress on many of his goals. The team struggled to be able to tell me a strength. And a part of me was like, maybe that's why we're not having that success. Now, they had been down a long road, and I know there were reasons they may have felt frustrated, but it was at that point, it was like, then they wanted to go into a discussion of all the, but he does discussion. And it's like, no, because I don't need to hear that right now, because I need to build my relationship. It's like, I do need to know some of the history, and they did give me that. But it's like, I don't need your personal experience, because right now I need to build that relationship. And I think sometimes we struggle with strengths. I think it was interesting to me at one point in my career too. I happened to be at a training that was on some social, emotional, and behavioral topics. It was mostly done with general education teachers. Again, all out of state. And I think this has changed because it was back when social emotional learning wasn't quite as talked about. And the person who was leading our training asked us to take 2 minutes and think of a student who might be struggling in our classroom and write down every strength we could. And, I think part of being, especially a special ed teacher in this world, or like being a parent of these kids, is that you learn to look at all those strengths and highlight them. And I was just writing list and list and list. And when we got done, they asked how many strengths some of these other teachers had. And most of them were less than 5 for a student. And I had a list, I felt like, of 30, because I think we just learn to do that. And I think it's a practice skill. I think the more you practice looking at those strengths, the better people get. So we certainly encourage that and practice it a lot. So I encourage you to think about these kind of strengths that your child has. If you have one that you'd love to throw in the chat and just share that something your child excels at, whether they have a behavioral need or not, and you're just learning along. And this activity has been done, we're especially better if you're in person in groups, but that you can think it, you can put it in the chat, and you can even shout it to somebody who's in the room with you or share it, but feel free to do so and think about that often. I've met some of the most incredible kids working with these kids who struggle. Their strengths are amazing. Like I said, I had one friend who taught me everything I've never learned about. We learned about the blood moon versus a strawberry moon, and we got to see the solar eclipse together. It's like those kind of things. To have some of them who are so creative and artistic. We had one student where he would get so frustrated, but if you gave that kid a pencil and a paper, he would draw every reason of why he was upset. So it wasn't that he couldn't tell us, it was he couldn't tell us with words, but his art was amazing. He'd gone to speech one day and he came back with this picture of that he'd drawn of the speech language pathologist just angry. So I knew something had happened, but I knew exactly who it had happened with because I could tell from his art exactly who it involved. and then we could problem solve it. So there are some like indirect ways we can, again, collect data where it might be with other adults, not necessarily directly with the student. Again, looking at those record reviews are powerful. There are some behavioral rating scales. Odds are if you have a kid who has had some social emotional behavioral, you have done some of those. If you ever take a child to the doctor and you're looking at attention, they often give you a rating scale there as well. There are some checklists and assessments that can be done. Some are more around curriculum, some social emotional. Some are just surveys to find out those things your child likes that they might be willing to work for, the reinforcers, what would give them positive attention, positive supports, things they need. There are adaptive behavior skills, social skill assessments, and social communication for that language piece of how they're communicating that can be looked at. And we can interview. I encourage through this whole process as well. I always think that I've worked with kids from kindergarten through little, and it only can help as they get bigger to be able to talk through. Kids can usually tell you afterwards why things happen. They can often tell you how they're feeling through that whole process, not in the moment. When we're escalated again, or we go into that fight or flight, and that's not the part that can process and think and reason. We have to wait till we calm down and we get back into the part of our brain where we can reason, that we can talk through what happened. And then of course, we typically too will do some observations of the student. This one does require the parent consent when they're going through it, of like, what are we going to observe? Ideally, people are coming in and observing them during subjects where the team has talked about, are there times of the day that we know are harder for a student than others? Is it unstructured times? Do we have trouble in the lunchroom, maybe in gym class? Or do we have trouble in music where the sensory is higher? Or is it that math? Like, we just don't like math and that's a hard time. Ideally, you're going to observe not only at times that are hard, but during times that things go really well. Like, when does this child do really well? Oh, they're really a fan of art. Art they excel at. And oh, they love science. Science is great. Well, then let's make sure we observe some of both so that we can compare and contrast what was happening in both environments. And then when we observe, we're going to record and graph it in like an antecedent behavior consequence analysis. So that's an ABC. So what that means is, what's that antecedent? What happens right before the child has a behavior? What did the behavior look like? And then what was the consequence they got out of it? Which kind of comes to the function of behaviors, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. Or we can do a scatter plot that just says, when is this behavior happening throughout the day? And we just record when is it happening. So here is an example, and on the sheet you'll get, it'll have the sheet on it as well for notes, but it gives you an example. So for example, like one of them says, the student was asked to participate in math class, was what happened. So the teacher had asked him to participate. The student ignored him, or George, who's the student, ignored the teacher and kept his head on the desk. So then what was that consequence? So she asked twice, then she gave up and ignored him. So oftentimes as we go to a consequence, that's when we're going to start kind of looking at, what did the student get out of the behavior? Well, he got 2 times he was prompted. That might be teacher's attention twice. Then he got ignored and wasn't forced to work. I mean, he might have gotten out of work. So we kind of do some of that analysis throughout these and seeing what happened. Or a scatter plot, if data is being taken that way, just means that they have a chart, probably something like this one, where they go through these different time frames, and they probably they can put an X of, did this behavior happen during this time? And then you graph it onto a graph like this, and it might show you, and this is just an example of a scatter plot, and it's titled Old Faithful Eruptions. But so, you know, how many minutes between, and to what extent did it happen? So we will talk a little bit more about the functions, the why behavior might happen. But at first, as we're looking at that antecedent behavior consequence, or ABC chart, we're looking at what happened right before the behavior. And what happens right before, in like behavioral analyst terms, is called a setting event. So was there something right before the behavior that happened that was more likely to trigger a behavior? So this could be those times, we also will look at, is there times where the behaviors don't occur? But we want to know, is there specific locations where the behavior is more likely to happen? Conditions, the behavior does not occur. Individuals that are present. Do behaviors happen more often with certain teachers or paraprofessionals than others? Do they end faster with certain people or others? Antecedents, like, are there things that occur right before? Are there conditions? What happens right after? And then are there common setting events, like common of these things that keep happening before behaviors? And are there other behaviors that are associated with the problem or like the behavior? So sometimes we will see a student who, when they start to get agitated, might like tap their fingers or might start rocking in their chair. And some of those might be that signal that the other behavior is going to come. That can be that like setting event, that like warning of, hey, this is coming. So we want to figure out what are some of those things that are at play, but we also know as we start to look at the child in a classroom, we want to take some baseline data. So we want to know, what are those behaviors we're watching? And even though a child may exhibit multiple behaviors, we often encourage that an IEP team start with 1 to 2 behaviors as a focus. So what are the 2 that are most disruptive first, and really try to focus on those with the hope that some of that will impact other behaviors. But we know if we try to focus on 5 things at once, we can't always give it the attention it needs. So really the best practice is to pick 1 to 2 and start there. But with those behaviors, then we want to take some baseline data. We want to know, we want to have multiple data points showing, so we can start to analyze and look for those kind of trends. What's happening across time? When they say, how long should a functional behavioral analysis take? It varies. If we have a student whose behavior is impeding learning and that of others, we want it to be, we don't want to go too fast, but we need it to be fast enough that we can take some action. So ideally, you're going to have a minimum of 3 to 5 data points, ideally up to like 8 or 10. And it should be, again, collected across environments where the student is doing well, plus behaviors where they're having some struggle. And so we want to make sure that we determine what kind of data are we taking. So if a student exhibits behaviors like screaming, throwing objects, or slamming doors, do we want to know how many times that happens in a day? Do we want to know how long the student is yelling? Does it make a difference if it's 15 minutes or 30 minutes? And when? Like, are there times of the day it's more likely? Is there a pattern? Are there days of the week that it's more likely to happen? Through some of this, we had a student who I know that when they first came to my room, we just knew the student sometimes struggled and had behaviors, and we didn't really know a whole lot. And even just in tracking what days of the week and what times of the day, we realized that it was only happening toward the end of the week, every week. And the reasoning that we came to eventually, with the help of mom and dad and filling in some of those gaps, is we were like, man, something must happen on Wednesday, because Thursday and Friday just are tough. Well, parents were divorced, and it was the day that the student had to transition homes. And it's not that the student didn't love being at both homes. It was just a hard transition for them to flip in the middle of the week. And so it was good for us to know. It helped us to be able to put some supports in place and provide some empathy, especially too, for the student. And then we're going to compare and analyze. We're going to look for those patterns. When are things happening? We're going to make sure we know what strengths and skills we want to highlight and work on with the student, because we want to build off the things they're good at. Are there any things that happen before the behavior, those setting events, that are concerns or that we could prevent or change? Are there triggers? What consequences does the child get after? What interventions have been tried? Are any worth trying again, ensuring that we do it consistently and with fidelity? Or do we just need to scrap and move on to some other interventions? And what are the students' preferences? What would the student like to see? So I think a great visual that had been shared with me was thinking about getting to the root of the problem, right? I mean, a part of us, we want to end the behavior that's happening and we want to do it quickly. And sometimes we can find a way to do that just by saying, addressing the behavior we see. Stop that, blah, 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 right? But it's only when we give them a different response, right? We show them something that could be more effective and efficient to get what they want, kind of dig to the root of that problem and address it there, that we can make change. And so how do we dig deeper? This is, to me, a very powerful learning experience because it wasn't until I was even out of school that I learned about the functions of behavior. So in the behavior, like analytical realm, for those who are, there are people in schools who are board certified behavioral analysts. They go through years of training around behavior, but they say that there are 4 reasons kids, or functions. So kids get 4 things out of behavior. And odds are it ties to 1, possibly 2 of them at play at any given time. And they're either trying to get this thing or avoid it. So, and the easy way to remember it is with the acronym SEAT. However, I know some people who prefer EATS, whichever order it works for you. They may be trying to get sensory input. They may like to hear loud noise, they need to hear music. That's what's good for them. They need to avoid loud sounds. So they're either trying to get sensory or avoid it. Some kids like pressure, right? And sometimes we get it in crazy ways. Right out of college, I did an internship where I worked, and there was this little guy, and he would go up, and at that time, the procedure when he was really hurting others, per his parents' request, was actually to use one of the crisis prevention techniques. So there was a child hold that was like a hug. And this kid liked the sensation of that, but only when one male staff would do it, because he was a bigger guy who could squeeze super tight. So that whenever that staff was working, he would run over and hit other kids purposefully, because he knew that when he was injuring others, the plan was to give him this big bear hug really tight. And if our male staff was there, that was just what he liked, and he'd do it on purpose. But never happened when us females were the only ones working. And it took us a while to tweeze out the need that he was going for, that sensory need, and it was being met. And so we had to rechange our plan and reroute what we were doing, because that was not going to be appropriate. But then as part of this behavioral process, we know he's trying to get that in a negative way. How can we give him that same sensory input in a positive way? Which could look like, from these big guys or whatever our staff members, like, is it appropriate if the parents are on board to give this child a big hug if he's doing well? Well, maybe we need to just switch it and make it a positive for doing what's right and give him that input he was still after. Or are they trying to escape something? Meaning we're trying to escape work, which often looks like, leaving the table or sitting in a corner of the classroom. Or are we trying to escape to something we like? Sometimes the escape is not away from something. It might be trying to get escape to something. I want to leave my desk doing homework to go to the reading center because I really like to look at books. Or attention. So we're either trying to get positive attention or negative attention, or we are trying to avoid attention. We have those opposite kids of those who hope a teacher never calls on them, don't want them to be talked to. Or there's tangible is our T, trying to get an object. So maybe we want to have toys or fidgets, or maybe we want to get away from an object we don't like. But when we look at going through, especially in that ABC, when we were thinking about that antecedent and then the behavior happens and there's a consequence, what is the child getting out of, what function is the child getting out of these? And as we start doing, like, where we record kind of those events through an observation, we can start looking at those consequences and starting to see if patterns emerge with a why. So that if your child is looking for sensory, how are we going to provide it more frequently in a positive way than the child is trying to seek it negatively? Or if the child's not wanting to be in a certain environment, how do we help them learn to escape in an approved way? So if a child gets stressed and runs, we need to teach them how to ask for a break. We need to create a space that they could go escape to with rules and expectations, but teach them how to take a break in an appropriate way. I think all of us use some variations of these in our life already. I think many of us have sat in an environment where it was too loud, and we have that self-regulation ability to cover our ears or to take some deep breaths, or if we need to get up and walk out where it's a little quieter. Sometimes these kids don't have that. Some of these things send them into that fight or flight. And so we have to build those skills of how do we get there. But the tricky part in this initial part when behaviors are starting is that we have to figure out how to do it and do it more frequently or before they hit those times where the negative behaviors occur. So as we get through getting done with this functional behavioral analysis path, we write a hypothesis statement. So after we've collected our data and we've really looked at those different functions, we're going to say when, and we're going to describe an antecedent. When this happens, the student, and we explain those behaviors, will do this in order to get like what? What's that function? Or what are they trying to get out of? So we kind of create that. Here's what we think. When this happens, the student's going to do this, and it's going to give them that. And that's going to help us to figure out how to write that behavior intervention plan. Because our behavior plan is really just taking this information we've gained here and saying, here's how we're going to create a positive payment system. So how long is a functional behavioral assessment valid? Well, as long as we can still use what we find to make socially meaningful changes for the student. Ooh, it's another one of those kind of big phrases that can be hard to analyze, but our best practice in the purple bubble, we would tell an IEP team, is to still make sure you're reviewing it every year, if not more frequently. If you're still seeing struggles in behavior, maybe it's not appropriate, but we also don't want to throw this out too fast because we do have to have some time to try out some different hypotheses, some interventions to see what works. But it is something that should be visited at least once a year as your team would meet for an IEP meeting. And so kind of like I said, as you meet every year, you're just going to talk about, is this still appropriate and is it working? And I know we're down on time, so we'll talk quickly a little bit about the behavior intervention plan, but this is really the shorter part because the hardest work is figuring out why. That's why it's called a functional behavioral analysis. What's that function? What's happening? Excuse me. So once we have that functional behavioral analysis, we're going to write, it's called a behavior intervention plan or a BIP. What we want that behavior intervention plan to do is to give the student a positive replacement behavior that they can do. What is the thing we want them to do? We got to teach them what would we rather have than that negative behavior. And so we want it to be based kind of on those hypotheses. Why do we think the behavior is happening? We want it to be student-centered. We want this to include their voice. We want their input. We want it to make sure it fits their day. And we want it to have the ability to trade things out or try new things if we need to. Sorry, I'm on that. Just getting over those nice 10-day viral colds. So what is our desired replacement behavior? What are we trying to teach them? If they're a kid who's trying to get attention by blurting out, we're maybe trying to teach them to raise their hand to get attention. And we're going to talk about how are we going to teach that replacement behavior. So here was just an example of, for a kid who maybe struggles about what to do when angry, having some explicit instruction done by a special ed teacher and giving them something like cards that they can carry with them that gives them different choices of what to do when they're angry. I also, in the links, will give you some links to some really great reinforcer surveys. So what this is as you'll see, this is just a snippet, and I give you the link to the full reinforcer survey. But this is called a forced choice reinforcement survey. So for each number, 1, 2, 3, you have to pick one or the other. Would you rather a teacher to write 100% on your paper, or would you rather be the first to finish your work? and they pick one. And so for each one, they pick one. And as you can see, it gives you like letter codes after it, and you add up how many of each letter they picked, but it tells you, do they want adult approval? Do they want competitive approval? Do they want their peers to offer approval and feedback? Do they want something that's a reward just by themselves, or do they want something that's consumable, like a prize or a snack? But it gives you, just by them just doing this quick, this or this, this or this, and sometimes they really have fun doing it. It might give you an idea of what kind of reinforcement they'd want when they're doing what's right. And then in our behavior intervention plan, we're also going to talk about what do we do to negative behavior, like how are we addressing as a team so that everybody in the building addresses this the same. How do we address the negative behaviors? We don't want punishment. It's not about consequences. It's just how would we respond? Is there a set phrase we're going to re-say? Is there a certain redirection we're going to give so that it's the same? If they are a student that is aggressive or can harm themselves or others, is there a need to ensure there's a safety plan and how the team will respond? Then we're going to, again, we took that baseline of how this child's behavior is. We're going to put a line in place because that's our intervention. We're going to start trying something, and then we're going to take data to see if it's working. But here's the tricky part about behavior is that if you find something that actually matches the child's function, that is actually correct, you get what's called an extinction burst, which means often the behavior gets worse before it gets better. So it's hard, and sometimes when the behavior starts to get worse, people quit and think it's not working. You do need to give it a few days, some time to see if it does turn around. And that's when you really need to have some cheerleaders cheering on all team members and supporting everybody, because even I hope that your team is cheering with you as parents, because I know even that burst can carry it home, right? Things get worse before they get better. Hopefully the whole team is working together. And then just remember, find a way to keep data. Oftentimes it might look like a behavior chart that goes between home and school. How can we collect this data? How can we celebrate it? When is the team going to review if things are working? How many data points are we going to go, or how many days are we going to go if it's not working before we get the team together and figure out what changes should be made? These things should be ironed out as well. Hopefully, if your child is having behaviors at school and struggling, your team would be talking about the behavioral data more than just at progress reporting periods, but a little more frequently. And then I think this is just the truth. Anticipate that the child will have plateaus, they will have failures, there will be backslides and setbacks and regression, but we have to support and encourage them at these times, and kids need love when they deserve it the least, or when they feel they deserve it the least. I feel like these kids take so much of this personally as well, and it's important to remind them that this isn't, that they are not doing the best they can, because many times these kids are trying so hard to make everybody so happy, and their body, and like I said, sometimes it's that fight or flight, and they just can't yet have those executive function skills to work through it. And they need to know it's okay, and we're with them, and we're going to figure it out. I've also found when the kids take part in helping set goals of where we want this data to be, even as young as kindergarten, if we can track it in a way they can understand it, sometimes it helps them move faster to meet our goals when they feel like they are a part of it and they're making those decisions. And so like I've had kiddos where, you know, we've learned that they need a reinforcer about every 10 minutes to stay on task. That was what we learned. And so they would, every 10 minutes, they would earn a reward. And there was nothing more exciting than when we could look at the data and they're like, man, I've been getting them for like, 10 times in a row, or whatever our goal was. And then it was like, well, do you think you could go to 15 minutes? Like, oh, I don't know. And even sometimes the kids, like I've had more than once a kid sit down with me and go, Mrs. Woodcock, I'm pretty sure I'm ready to go to 20 minutes now. Like, can we do it? Can we try it? And there's nothing better than knowing they understood what our goals are and that they're working for it themselves. And so again, when you get the notes, you'll get all these kind of resources. These are all links to different sites that have information, from parent information resources to the Council for Children with Behavioral Disorders. to some of those forced choice reinforcers, to some national centers who have some really great free training modules and things. So check them out. And that is all I have. I will answer some questions if you have them. I can stick around for a minute or two, but if you wouldn't mind, whether now or when you get the notes, as part of some of our federal funding and some of the work, the technical assistance we're doing, with our goal of being to increase the graduation rate for students with emotional disturbance. That's my personal project. That one of the ways we hope we can help increase rates is to share some of this information with everybody so that we can help these kids be more successful. So if you would just be willing to do the survey, whether scanning the QR code or going to that website and just filling out a short survey about the training tonight, it really helps us. With that, thanks.
Michelle, that was awesome. I'm going to shut off the recording in case anybody does have any questions, because we don't want personal questions to get on a recording. So I'm going to shut that